Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted to be part of this initiative, although I must say 5 slides, 10 minutes, I'm already feeling slightly hysterical, so let's hope this goes well. I know on the menu I'm down as Ageing and New Media, and that is indeed my new research area. It's a brand new research project though, so I don't actually have any real results to report yet. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the research that led to this project. And that research has been on migration and families. In fact, I've been researching migration and families for the last 30 years. And my interest in this subject was initially inspired by my own family migration history, in particular the story of my great-grandmother. Her husband, my great-grandfather, migrated to the southwest of Western Australia in 1925, leaving her behind in their hometown in the mountains on the Swiss-Italian border. At the time, she had 2 kids and 1 on the way, so it was a few years before this photo was taken because the 3rd child wasn't yet born when he left. It took 12 years for them to be reunited. It took 12 years for them to raise enough money to take the rest of the family to join them in the southwest of WA. And that kind of lengthy separation was not uncommon back then. Women like my great-grandmother were known as the white widows. And I became fascinated with how you maintain a family across that kind of distance and separation. And despite that long separation, this family stayed together. However, 2 short years after they were reunited, the war broke out, and my great-grandfather was interned for the duration as an enemy alien in South Australia, so they couldn't even visit each other. My great-grandmother was left to run a relatively isolated potato farm pretty much on her own, 2 short years after arriving. She was a woman who loved singing, and the story goes that from the day of the internment, she never sang again. Now, families and migration, distance and separation, continue to be an issue for many families today. In the research literature, these families are known as transnational families, families that stay together although they're separated by distance. They have family members in different nations, if you like. And this is particularly the case for the rising numbers of domestic and care worker migrants across the globe, most of whom are women from developing countries who leave their children behind in order to work in the so-called global north. Australia does not yet have a significant number of domestic and care worker migrants, although this may change in the future with the current emphasis on temporary migration schemes, and we have to be particularly vigilant about this, and that's one of the areas of interest in my new project. Currently, however, in Australia, the burden of care is actually shouldered by the so-called sandwich generation. These are multi-generational households which are surprisingly on the increase in Australia, and this is impacting on women's labour force participation rates. Indeed, the ability of women to enter the paid workforce is one of the main drivers of domestic migration in other parts of the globe, and it's a big push factor for it happening here. Unlike the families of domestic care workers, where the adults migrate and the children are left behind, most transnational families in Australia today comprise adult migrant children separated from their ageing parents. So my first large project in this area was looking at exactly this. It began in 2000 and it's been ongoing. Perth, the most isolated capital city in the world, is the ideal place for this study. In fact, I'd like to ask you to raise your hands if you are yourself a member of a transnational family. Do you have family members in other parts of the... I rest my case. Okay, most of us are members of transnational families. So in this study, we collected over 200 life history interviews of adult migrants living in Perth, and we also went back to the homelands and interviewed their ageing parents. The homelands are the countries indicated on the slide. Now, one of the major themes of this research is represented by my favourite quotation from all these 200 interviews collected to date. When interviewed about her transnational family life, a grandmother in Ireland commented, "When my uncle migrated to Australia in the 1900s, we held a kind of wake for him in the local pub because we didn't know if we'd ever see him again." In contrast, when my nephew left for Australia a few years ago, his departure inspired the family to purchase a new computer. So in this quote, we have this insight into this massive social transformation that the impact of polymedia environments are having on our abilities to be co-present across distance. From a kind of social death, not knowing whether you'd see each other again, to the purchase of a new computer. And it's this co-presence across distance, how we can be there for each other across distance, that's the centre point of my research. And so if we contrast what it was like to be co-present across distance 100 years ago for my great-grandmother, we can say things like, it was asynchronous, you had to rely on irregular letters, telegrams, very costly phone calls eventually, and very rare visits. We didn't share real time in our communication. It was intermittent. It tended to be formulaic. We sort of inhabited imagined roles of the father, the mother, the daughter, because our ability to be in touch across distance was very limited. So we could talk about these as broken narratives, if you like. In contrast, co-presence across distance today is facilitated by polymedia environments, new media, access to many kinds of communication technologies that give us different ways to stay in touch across distance. So in contrast, co-presence now across distance is synchronous. We share co-presence in real time. It's continuous, multisensory. We have Skype, video, we can see, we can hear. It facilitates the sharing of detailed and everyday narratives that actually approximate physical co-presence. So some of my work is challenging, I guess, notions about the normative way we value physical co-presence. People say things like, it's like they're really here, or it's like they're always near. I'm not suggesting that co-presence across distance is easy or simple. Like any type of care work, people have to work very hard at staying in touch. But some people do this remarkably well. For example, Antonella, an only child of Italian migrants, left home to work overseas 30 years ago when her parents were relatively young and independent. They developed a routine pattern of co-presence across distance, which at first consisted of her mother leaving a phone message in the morning, due to the time difference when she was still asleep, and then they would have a phone conversation in the evening every single day. The phone message was changed to a text message when the technology became available, and phone conversations became Skype calls. In addition, there were emails exchanged, if not daily, several times a week, and Antonella visited every Christmas. They exchanged greeting cards and gifts throughout the year. Antonella's experience shows us that important and effective care can be delivered across distance. However, distance support networks are usually invisible to most care-related policy, which tends to focus only on local or in-place support. And that's particularly the case in aged care, and particularly the case in residential aged care. So, some other findings to leave you with from this research. The polymedia environments that many of us enjoy today, which deliver access to different types of technology, give us, for the first time in history, the ability to choose when and how we stay in touch across distance. In fact, some of the more affluent families in our sample even used the flying grandmother. There may even be some in this room, where they fly the grandma in from another country to look after the kids for extended periods if they have to travel or work abroad. The ability to choose between different types of communication technologies introduces a moral element and a set of moral obligations about the choice of which technology to use and for which purpose. And perhaps, given the time limits, the quickest example I can use is to ask you a question. If I ask you all, if your mum is living in another country, is it okay to text her happy birthday rather than phone? Okay, we have a mixed result. For most people, it's a big, definite no. The point being that there are moral implications about the choices we use, where in the past, 100 years ago, there was no choice. The technology itself adds another dimension to the relationship, so we start to talk about human-computer interaction and the kinds of blurred results. So, for example, technology can have a phatic function. By this I mean that the content is not always that important. Rather, the act of using the technology is in itself an expression of copresence. So the text message sticker, just to let you know I'm thinking of you, or the ping of the message, without even needing to read it, it tells you something about the people you're staying connected with. Perhaps the most surprising finding of all is that ICTs have increased networks of care where migration in the past diminished them or truncated them. So in the past, generally what happened was a few key people tended to be responsible for gathering information and sharing it across distance. Usually women would write the letters, send the birthday cards, make the ritual phone calls. Today, in contrast, due to the impact of new technologies, men and younger generations are much more actively involved in these networks because they are usually the custodians of the technology. So a classic example in our field notes is grandma will ask grandson to set up the Skype, and usually it is that grandson's cousin who is setting up the call at the other end. Those two cousins then start a relationship through the regular calls, and before you know it, they're on Facebook and developing their own relationship outside the calls for grandma, with all the attendant obligations these relationships bring. In the past, those two cousins might not have interacted at all because of the limited technologies available. So technology is today expanding these networks of care. Of course, globalisation is a very uneven process, and not all families can afford the same levels of access. Capacity to use new technologies is also impacted by ability and disability. Access to adequate internet is largely dependent on governments, not individuals. And a couple of years ago, the UN actually argued a case to have access to the internet recognised as a human right. A final word about our new project, and this is where I come to the ageing and media bit. Oh my goodness. No, I won't. Is that bringing an analysis of distance support networks to aged care is what we're all about, is what we're trying to do, to facilitate and recognise the important role of distant care supports in the lives, in the local lives of the elderly. Thank you.